It was a quiet evening in Provo, Utah, the kind of calm that made you believe nothing bad could ever happen there. The streets were still, washed in the fatting orange light of a late summer sunset. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across well-trimmed lawns, the smell of wet grass hanging in the air. Families were finishing dinner, the sound of laughter and clinking dishes drifting from open windows. To anyone passing through, it was just another peaceful night in a town where trouble seemed like something that only happened on TV. But underneath that stillness, something dark was beginning to take shape. At 8:43 p.m., the Provo Police Department received a call that would change everything. The dispatcher's headset crackled with the voice of a woman, shaking, gasping, terrified. She said there was an intruder in her home. She said she was hiding. She said he was armed. Her voice broke when she whispered that she could hear him walking down the hall. The dispatcher stayed calm, following protocol, sending 2 patrol units to the address on Aspen Ridge Drive. They had no reason to doubt her. Calls like that weren't common in Provo, but when they came in, they were treated like life-or-death emergencies. The neighborhood was one of those upper-middle-class stretches tucked close to the foothills. Wide streets, quiet cul-de-sacs, and homes that looked nearly identical, 2 stories, large windows, and American flags on porches. Everyone knew everyone, or at least waved when passing by. It was the kind of place where a police cruiser speeding through the streets turned heads. Inside one of those houses, the woman who made the call, let's call her Emily for now, sat trembling on the living room floor, clutching her phone. She wasn't crying anymore. The fear that had been in her voice moments ago was gone. Her eyes were fixed on the front window, her breathing steady now, almost rehearsed. She watched as the first set of flashing blue and red lights pulled up outside her house. Across town, another man, his name would soon make headlines, was closing up the small auto shop he managed. He didn't know that in less than 30 minutes his life would be torn apart by a phone call he didn't even make. He was tired, dirty from a long day's work, and thinking only about getting home to shower. He'd been trying to fix things lately, his marriage, his finances, his reputation. But he had no idea that someone else had already made up their mind about him. That's how it began. A normal night, a believable story, and a call that sounded urgent enough to send half the police department into motion. Emily wasn't known for drama. At least that's what people would say later. She moved to Provo 3 years earlier, renting the house on Aspen Ridge after a messy breakup. She was quiet, polite, and always seemed a bit fragile. Neighbors described her as kind, but a little off. The kind of woman who smiled too tightly and avoided eye contact when something uncomfortable came up. No one really knew her, though a few whispered that she'd had problems with her ex-boyfriend before. Her ex, the man who was about to be at the center of this entire mess, hadn't spoken to her in months. They'd been on and off for years, their relationship tangled with jealousy, guilt, and accusations. He'd moved on, or at least tried to, but in her mind, it seemed, he never really left. There were signs, small things that only made sense in hindsight. The way she talked about him in the past tense, but with a strange kind of possession. The way she'd post cryptic messages online about betrayal and revenge. It didn't draw much attention then, but soon everyone would be replaying those words over and over. When the police arrived, Emily ran to the door. Her face was pale, her voice shaking as she told them the intruder had gone out the back. 2 officers split up, one inside, one circling around. They searched every room, guns drawn, clearing corners, calling out commands. Nothing. The house was spotless. No footprints. No forced entry. Not even a smudge on the back door she claimed the man had used. Still, her story sounded convincing enough. Her tears looked real. She kept saying she'd seen him, her ex, standing by her bedroom door with a knife. The officers didn't find a knife. They didn't find anything. But when a woman says her abusive ex just broke into her home, you don't ignore it. They put out a bolo, be on the lookout, for his vehicle. A dark blue Ford pickup. Within minutes, 3 more patrol cars were sweeping nearby streets. Meanwhile, he was driving home, humming along to the radio, completely unaware that police were being told he was armed and dangerous. That's how fast lies can travel, faster than reason, faster than the truth. What no one realized then was how carefully this had been planned. The tone of her voice, the words she used, even the pauses, everything sounded like panic because she'd practiced it. She wanted him to suffer, wanted to scare him the way she said he'd scared her. But that's the problem with control. It doesn't stay neat once you set it loose. In a town where people left their doors unlocked and trusted the system to keep them safe, no one saw the storm that was coming. All they saw that night were flashing lights bouncing off white fences, a woman's trembling hands, and the start of something that felt real. Provo was about to learn just how dangerous a single lie could be. The next few days after the 911 call were strange in Provo. At first, the story spread quietly, neighbors whispering that Emily's ex had broken in, that she'd barely escaped. Then the police presence made it impossible to ignore. They were everywhere, cruisers parked at the end of the street, officers knocking on doors, asking questions. It gave the neighborhood a jittery kind of energy, like everyone was waiting for something bad to happen again. Emily stayed home, refusing to leave. She gave statements, repeated her version of the story again and again. Each time, small details changed, what he was wearing, what he said, how he looked at her, but her voice always cracked at the right moments. The officers took her words seriously. The more she spoke, the more they began to believe she was genuinely afraid. Her ex, whose name was Daniel, was called in for questioning 2 days later. He didn't argue. He showed up at the station wearing his work uniform, smelling of oil and metal. He was confused, tired, and a little angry, but mostly scared. He told them he hadn't been near her house in months. He showed them his phone location history, his work logs, and even the security footage from the auto shop that showed he'd been there during the time of the call. The officers couldn't ignore that. The facts didn't fit her story. Still, something about Emily's demeanor, her tears, her shaking hands, made people hesitate. Maybe she'd made a mistake. Maybe she thought she saw him. Maybe trauma had blurred the truth. The officers let Daniel go, but the damage was already done. He could feel the weight of suspicion following him out of the building. That night he called his sister, Megan, and told her everything. His voice was low, tired, but laced with disbelief. "She's lying," he said. "I don't know why, but she's trying to ruin me." Megan didn't know what to say. She'd never trusted Emily, not since the beginning. There had always been something possessive about her, how she wanted Daniel to answer every call, every message, how she'd show up unannounced at his shop when he didn't text back. But even she didn't think Emily would go this far. Emily, meanwhile, was getting attention she hadn't had in months. The officers checked in on her regularly. Neighbors brought her meals. Some even installed extra cameras around their homes, just in case. She looked fragile but calm, often stepping out on her porch in the evenings, wrapped in a blanket, watching patrol cars drive by. To outsiders, she seemed like a victim holding on after a terrifying ordeal. Inside, though, she was feeding on it. The sympathy, the protection, the sense of control. For once, people were listening to her. Then came the messages. Late at night, Emily started sending texts to herself from a hidden app that let her spoof numbers. She sent them from what appeared to be Daniel's phone, messages filled with threats, begging her to talk to him, telling her he was watching. She saved screenshots and forwarded them to the police. "He won't stop," she said. "He wants to scare me." By the end of that week, Daniel's world was collapsing. He was put on temporary leave from work while the investigation continued. His landlord asked him to move out early because things were getting complicated. Even his friends began to avoid him. He felt like everyone was watching him with silent judgment. He'd never felt more alone. He tried to confront Emily once, at a grocery store parking lot. It wasn't planned. He saw her getting out of her car and all the anger he'd been swallowing boiled over. He walked straight up to her, his voice trembling, demanding to know why she was doing this. But before he could finish, she screamed. Loud enough for people to turn, loud enough for someone to call the police again. When the officers arrived, Emily was shaking, her face wet with tears. She told them he followed her there, that she feared for her life. Daniel was taken away in handcuffs while bystanders recorded on their phones. He didn't resist, but his eyes told a story his mouth couldn't, of disbelief, of helplessness, of a man losing everything to someone else's lie. That moment changed everything. Emily realized how powerful her story had become. It didn't matter that there was no evidence. All she had to do was cry, and people believed her. The more chaos she caused, the more attention she got. Somewhere in her mind, she convinced herself it was justice, that he deserved this for all the ways he'd hurt her emotionally when they were together, that it was payback for the nights he ignored her calls, for the way he walked away when she needed him to stay. But underneath that sense of control, cracks were forming. The more she lied, the harder it became to keep her story straight. Police started noticing inconsistencies. The tech team couldn't confirm that the messages came from Daniel's phone. The security footage from the grocery store showed him parked far from her car until the moment he walked up, no sign of stalking. Still, Emily pushed forward. Every night she wrote in a notebook, pages filled with angry thoughts, memories twisted into accusations. Her handwriting changed over time, growing messy and frantic. She wrote things like, "He deserves to be scared, and no one believes me unless I make them." Daniel, on the other hand, was falling apart. He stopped sleeping. His mind replayed the same moments again and again, The night of the false call, her scream in the parking lot, the way the officers looked at him like he was dangerous. He kept trying to prove his innocence, but every time he did, Emily created a new story that kept the doubt alive. He wasn't just fighting her anymore, he was fighting the whole system. One night, Megan found him sitting in the dark in her living room, staring at his phone. He looked broken, hollow. "I think she wants to destroy me," he said quietly, "and she's doing it." His sister tried to comfort him, but he just shook his head. "You don't understand," he whispered. "Once people believe a lie, it doesn't matter what the truth is." Meanwhile, the police were starting to feel uneasy, too. Officer Ruiz, one of the first responders to Emily's 911 call, couldn't stop thinking about how clean the house had been that night. No broken locks, no footprints, no mess. He handled dozens of domestic calls before, and something about this one didn't sit right. When he brought it up to his supervisor, he was told to let it go. She'd been through enough, they said, but Ruiz couldn't. As days turned into weeks, small truths started surfacing. Emily's neighbors began remembering things, seeing her outside that night before the supposed break-in, packing her driveway while on the phone. Another neighbor recalled hearing her car start just before the police arrived. When detectives asked why she hadn't mentioned that, Emily broke down again, saying she was too traumatized to remember. The story was unraveling, but she couldn't stop. The attention, the pity, it had become addictive. She started showing up at the police station unannounced, crying, saying Daniel had been driving past her house again. The officers began to see through it, but by then, the damage to Daniel's life was irreversible. He'd lost his job, his apartment, and most of his friends. And yet, there was still a part of Emily that felt like she hadn't done enough. She wanted him to feel fear. The kind of fear she believed he'd caused her years ago. She wanted him to break completely. One night, she called 911 again. Her voice was calm this time, too calm. She said Daniel had come back. She said he had a gun. The dispatcher's heart raced. Within minutes, half the department was on its way to Aspen Ridge Drive. As the sirens approached, Emily stood at her window, watching. There was no intruder, no one outside, just the cold, empty street glowing under the streetlights. She smiled slightly as the flashing lights filled her living room. But this time, something went wrong. One of the officers, Ruiz, noticed inconsistencies right away. The call timing didn't match her earlier claims. Her phone records didn't line up. And when they checked nearby cameras, there was no sign of Daniel's truck anywhere in the area. It was the beginning of the end, but not before things spiraled into something no one could take back. In Provo, the line between fear and power was starting to blur. What had begun as a false cry for help was quickly turning into something that felt unstoppable, an obsession that had taken a life of its own, one lie at a time. The night everything came crashing down in Provo was colder than usual for late summer. The air felt sharp, restless, like something terrible was waiting to happen. A thin layer of fog had settled over Aspen Ridge Drive, making the streetlights look soft and ghostly. Inside her house, Emily paced back and forth across the living room, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. Her mind was a storm, half panic, half thrill. She had made so many calls, told so many stories, and now everything was slipping through her fingers. The police were starting to doubt her. Her neighbors had stopped visiting. She could feel the sympathy fading, replaced with suspicion. She couldn't let that happen. She needed one more call, one final act that would make them believe again. She wanted to make them see her as the victim, not the liar they were starting to whisper about. The thought of losing that control felt unbearable. At 9:17 p.m., Emily picked up her phone. Her fingers trembled, not from fear but excitement. She called Daniel. It was the first time she'd reached out to him in weeks. He didn't answer at first. Then after 3 rings, his voice came through, tired, heavy, confused. "What do you want, Emily?" Her voice cracked. "You need to come here, please." He hesitated. "No, I'm not getting near you again. You've already ruined my life." "There's something you need to see," she whispered. "It's about the police, about what they found." He was silent for a moment. Deep down, Daniel still wanted closure. He still wanted to understand how the woman he once loved had turned his life into a nightmare. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his keys and got in his truck. He didn't know that this drive would be his last. As his truck rolled through the quiet streets of Provo, the fog thickened. The radio played softly, but his thoughts drowned it out. He wasn't going there to fight. He just wanted it to end, to finally look her in the eye and make her stop. He kept imagining what he would say, rehearsing every word. "You need help, Emily. You have to stop this." He believed that if he stayed calm, maybe she'd listen. When he pulled into Aspen Ridge Drive, he parked across from her house. The lights inside were dim. The curtains were drawn. Everything looked too still. He sat there for a few seconds, debating whether to even get out. But then he saw movement, her shadow by the window. He sighed, opened the door, and walked toward the front porch. Inside, Emily's heart pounded as she watched him approach. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of losing control over the story. She called him there with a plan, though even she didn't fully understand what that plan was. Maybe she just wanted to scare him, or maybe she wanted proof that he'd come, something to show the police later. Her mind twisted every thought until right and wrong blurred completely. Daniel knocked once. "Emily, open the door," he said softly. "I just want to talk." When she opened it, the look in her eyes stopped him cold. They were wide and unfocused, trembling between fear and rage. She looked exhausted, makeup smudged, hair messy, but there was something sharp beneath it all. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "You asked me to," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You told me you had something to show me." For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Years of love, anger, and confusion hung heavy between them. Then her voice broke. "You ruined me, Daniel. You made everyone think I'm crazy." "I didn't do anything to you," he said, stepping closer. "You did this to yourself. You called 911. You lied. Why, Emily? Why did you do that?" Her hands clenched into fists. "Because you left me." The words came out like a scream, raw and shaking. "You walked away like I didn't matter. You made me feel invisible." Daniel took a breath, his voice soft but pained. "I left because I couldn't live like that anymore. You wanted to control everything. I was scared of you." Something in her snapped. She lunged toward him, shoving him hard in the chest. "You're lying," she screamed. "You made me this way." He caught her wrists, trying to calm her. "Stop, Emily, please, just stop." But she didn't. She was crying now, loud, broken sobs that shook her entire body. Her mind raced with every rejection, every silent phone, every look he'd given her that said he'd stopped loving her long ago. She couldn't take it. She needed him to see her pain, to feel it. On the coffee table behind her was a kitchen knife she'd placed earlier, part of the proof she planned to show the police if they came again. In her mind, it was harmless, just another prop in her story. But now, as anger consumed her, she grabbed it without thinking. Daniel froze. "Emily, no, don't do this." She held the knife tightly, her hands shaking. "You think I'm lying?" she shouted. "You think I'm crazy? I'll show you what crazy looks like." He tried to back away, his voice cracking. "Emily, please, put it down." She stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You destroyed everything I had." And then in one chaotic motion, she swung. The sound of the knife slicing through the air filled the room. Daniel tried to block it, raising his arm, but the blade caught him across the side. He stumbled back, gripping the wound, eyes wide in shock. Blood began to seep through his shirt, dark and fast. Emily froze, staring at what she'd done, her breath hitched, the room spinning around her. "Oh my God," she whispered. "I didn't mean." Daniel staggered toward the door, trying to reach for his phone. His vision blurred, the walls tilting. "Help," he managed to say, his voice weak. "Emily, call for help." But she didn't move. She just stood there, the knife still in her hand, trembling. Part of her wanted to help him, to fix what she'd done. Another part wanted to scream, to make it all disappear. He collapsed near the front door, his breathing ragged. The sound of his body hitting the floor snapped her back into reality. She dropped the knife, her hands slick with blood. The silence that followed was unbearable. She could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the wet sound of Daniel trying to breathe. She knelt beside him, pressing her hands against the wound, whispering his name over and over. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." But it was too late. His eyes began to lose focus, his body going still beneath her hands. For a few seconds, she just stared at him. Then panic hit her all at once. She grabbed the phone and dialed 911 again, her voice shaking. "There's been a break-in," she cried. "He attacked me, he tried to kill me." The dispatcher's voice tried to calm her, asking her to slow down, to explain what happened. But Emily kept repeating the same story, her words tangled in hysteria. When the first officers arrived, the scene was a blur of flashing lights and chaos. Emily was on the porch, screaming, covered in blood. She told them Daniel had forced his way in, that he'd come at her with a knife, and that she'd fought back in self-defense. But something didn't add up. The knife was lying on her side of the room. There were no signs of forced entry, and her injuries, just small scratches, looked like she'd made them herself. Officer Ruiz was the first to step inside. The smell of iron hit him immediately, blood thick in the air. Daniel's body lay near the doorway, his hand still outstretched toward the phone. Ruiz's eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. Something about the scene felt too neat, too arranged. Emily kept crying, saying, "He was going to kill me. He wouldn't stop." But her words sounded rehearsed, like she was reading from a script she'd already practiced 100 times. The officers separated her, guiding her to the back of the ambulance. Her hands trembled, not from grief, but from realization. She knew the story was slipping away from her again. The questions were already coming, and this time she had no more lies left that could save her. Inside the house, Ruiz crouched beside Daniel's body. The man's phone lay inches away. When they checked it later, they found her call logs, the proof that she'd asked him to come, the texts she'd sent, the timestamps. It was all there. The truth, finally, had bled its way to the surface. By the time they placed Emily in the back of the police car, she wasn't crying anymore. Her face was blank, her voice quiet. As the car pulled away, the lights flashing across her pale face, she whispered to herself, "I just wanted him to listen." Outside, the street was silent again. The fog had lifted, but the calm that followed felt heavy, like the town itself was holding its breath. What started as a lie meant to hurt had ended in a death that no one could ever undo. And for the people of Provo, it was a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous cries for help are the ones that were never real to begin with. The morning after the killing, Provo didn't feel like the same place. The neighborhood on Aspen Ridge Drive was sealed off with yellow tape, the hum of police radios echoing in the crisp air. Reporters gathered behind barricades, their cameras pointed at the quiet, blue-gray house that had once looked like any other home on the street. The town that prided itself on peace, on trust, on safety, was now staring at a scene that felt almost unreal. By sunrise, Daniel's name was all over the news, local mechanic killed in domestic dispute. The words were short, but they carried an entire life inside them. He wasn't a headline. He was someone's brother, someone's son, someone who'd been fighting to prove his innocence just days before. His family learned what happened from a news alert before the police even arrived at their door. His sister, Megan, dropped her phone when she saw his photo on the screen. She couldn't breathe. At first, people believed Emily's story. It sounded simple self-defense. She'd called 911 in panic. She had bruises, and she said he'd come to kill her. But as the police pieced things together, the truth began to shift. The call logs showed she'd invited him there. The knife had her fingerprints all over it. There were no signs of forced entry, no sign of struggle. The story she'd told the night before started to fall apart. Detective Ruiz couldn't shake the feeling he'd had from the beginning. He reviewed the old 911 recordings, listened again to her voice, calm one second, panicked the next. He noticed patterns, pauses that felt unnatural, details that kept changing. It didn't sound like fear anymore. It sounded like performance. When they brought Emily in for questioning again, she looked different. The tears were gone. She was pale, quiet, and empty. She kept repeating the same words. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to." Her voice barely carried across the room. Ruiz leaned forward. "You called him there, didn't you?" Her eyes flickered. He wanted to talk. "You asked him to come," Ruiz said firmly. "You knew the police were starting to doubt your story. You wanted to make him look dangerous again." Her lips trembled. "I just wanted him to understand," she whispered. "He ruined everything." The interview went on for hours. By the end of it, she stopped denying it. She confessed, but not in a clean, clear way. It came out tangled with excuses, with self-pity, with confusion. She said she'd only wanted to scare him, that he'd made her lose control. But she couldn't explain why the knife was already there, why she'd called him after weeks of accusing him of stalking her. The prosecutors moved fast. Within days, Emily was charged with second-degree murder and filing false police reports. She was taken into custody, her mugshot appearing on every local station that night. The image shocked people. The woman who once seemed fragile, almost pitiful, now looked hollow-eyed, dark, expressionless, the face of someone who'd finally run out of lies. The public reaction was a storm. At first, people were angry at Daniel. Then they were angry at the police. Then, when the truth surfaced, they turned on Emily with a kind of disgust that ran deep. Online forums filled with comments about how she'd weaponized fear, how she'd played the system. In a town where people believed lies didn't last long, her deception felt like a betrayal of everyone. Megan couldn't bring herself to read any of it. She spent her days sitting in Daniel's small apartment, surrounded by the things he left behind, his tools, his photos, his notebooks. She found one note on his desk, written a week before he died. "They won't believe me, but I still hope she gets help." It broke her heart more than anything else. Even after everything she'd done, he'd still wanted her to find peace. For Emily, jail was quiet, too quiet. She spent her first few nights staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The adrenaline that had driven her was gone, replaced with an aching emptiness. She replayed that night over and over, hearing his voice, seeing his face. There were moments she tried to convince herself it wasn't her fault, that he'd pushed her too far, that he'd made her feel cornered. But when the lights went out, when the silence closed in, she couldn't escape the truth. She killed him. Her parents visited once. They sat across from her in the visiting room, looking smaller than she remembered. Her mother's hands shook the whole time. "Why, Emily?" she asked softly. "Why did you do this?" Emily didn't answer. She just stared at the floor, her voice caught in her throat. Back in Provo, the town tried to move on, but it wasn't easy. The case became a local legend, something people whispered about when they drove past Aspen Ridge Drive. The house sat empty for months, its blinds still drawn, a silent reminder of what had happened inside. At Daniel's funeral, the church was packed. People from his old job came, neighbors, even strangers who'd followed the story. The pastor spoke about kindness, about truth, about how lies, no matter how small, can destroy entire lives. Megan sat in the front row, clutching a framed photo of her brother. She didn't cry during the service. The tears had already run out long before that day. Detective Ruiz attended too, standing quietly at the back. He'd seen plenty of tragedies in his career, but this one lingered. Maybe because it wasn't born from greed or rage. It was born from something smaller, something crueler. A need for control, a need to be believed. The trial began 4 months later. Emily pleaded guilty to avoid a longer sentence. The courtroom was filled with reporters, all waiting for her to show some kind of emotion, but she never did. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she finally spoke. Her voice was flat. "I didn't mean to kill him, I just didn't want to be invisible." The words hung in the air like smoke. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Some said it wasn't enough. Others said it didn't matter, nothing could undo what she'd done. For Megan, life after the trial was a blur of silence and small routines. She moved away from Provo, unable to bear the reminders. Sometimes, late at night, she'd catch herself reaching for her phone to text her brother, forgetting for a second that he'd never answer again. The grief came in waves, some quiet, some suffocating. But the one thing that stayed constant was the anger. Not loud, not vengeful, just a dull, endless ache that sat in her chest. As for Emily, prison stripped away the last layers of her story. There was no one left to believe her, no one left to pity her. The other inmates saw through her immediately. She spent most days in silence, working in the laundry, her thoughts looping endlessly through the same memories. She kept a small notebook hidden under her mattress. The first page was blank. The second had only one sentence. "I called him because I wanted him to care again." Years later, people in Provo would still talk about that case. They'd say it started with a lie, a single false 911 call, and ended with a life destroyed. Parents used it as a warning for their kids about truth and consequences. Police officers brought it up in training about how dangerous manipulation can be. The town eventually moved on, the headlines faded, and the house was sold. But for the people who'd lived through it, for Megan, for Ruiz, even for Emily, it never really left. It lingered in the quiet moments, in the uneasy stillness of the nights, in the way everyone now hesitated before believing the next cry for help. Because in Provo, they had learned something the hard way. Not every victim is innocent, and not every scream for rescue is what it seems. In the years that followed, the story of Emily Carson and Daniel Miller became more than just a tragic headline. It became a cautionary tale that forced a small town, and eventually the country, to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, gender, and the fragility of trust. What began as a story of love gone wrong had unraveled into a haunting portrait of how lies, fear, and manipulation could destroy not just 2 lives, but ripple outward, wounding families, communities, and the public conscience. Emily's trial had ended swiftly, but its echoes lingered. She accepted a plea deal, avoiding life imprisonment in exchange for 20 years behind bars. Some viewed the sentence as merciful, others thought it too lenient. In her final statement to the court, she said, "I didn't want to hurt anyone, I just wanted to be believed." Those words stayed with everyone who heard them, not as a justification, but as a reminder of how powerful and dangerous the need for validation can be. For Daniel's family, justice felt hollow. Megan attended every hearing, every appeal, every press briefing, clinging to the hope that the system would somehow give her brother back what had been taken. It never could. The verdict didn't bring relief, only a quiet, unending exhaustion. She once told a reporter, "They call it closure, but there's no such thing. There's only learning how to carry what's left." Her grief became her shadow, shaping every day that followed. In prison, Emily changed in ways no one outside could fully see. The woman who once performed emotion for an audience of police, reporters, and social media now lived in a world stripped of attention. The silence inside the prison walls was suffocating. Over the years, she withdrew further from the other inmates, barely speaking unless required. She worked in the laundry, kept her head down, and wrote in the same worn notebook she'd started her first week inside. The guards described her as docile and cooperative, but occasionally, in moments of rare conversation, she would mutter to herself about the night it all ended, about how he shouldn't have come. The legal aftermath of the case reshaped how local authorities in Utah handled domestic violence and false reporting. A new policy was introduced requiring every 911 claim of abuse to be reviewed by a specialist before public release, to prevent premature vilification or false narratives. Detectives began receiving more in-depth training on the psychological aspects of manipulation, particularly when fear is used as a weapon. Detective Ruiz retired 2 years after the case concluded, but in interviews he admitted that the Carson Miller case never left his mind. He'd seen brutality before, murders born of rage, desperation, greed, but this was different. It wasn't about hate, he said. It was about power and the need to be seen. That's what made it so chilling. It could happen to anyone who mistakes attention for love. His words were later quoted in an article exploring the phenomenon of inverted victimhood, cases where perpetrators construct narratives of persecution to gain sympathy or control. In the public eye, Emily became a symbol, first of deception, then of debate. Some argued she was a manipulative sociopath. Others saw her as a mentally unstable woman failed by the system. Think pieces flooded the internet for months, with headlines like "The Danger of False Victim Narratives" and "When Empathy Goes Too Far." But over time, her story slipped into the archives of forgotten scandals, remembered only when a similar case surfaced. Yet for those closest to the tragedy, forgetting was never possible. Megan continued to speak occasionally at victim advocacy events, not about vengeance, but about truth. She would stand on small stages in community centers and tell her brother's story, not as a cautionary tale about women who lie, but about the importance of listening without bias. "Justice isn't about believing one side," she'd say softly. "It's about finding what's real, no matter who it hurts." Her words often left the room silent. The town of Provo eventually returned to its quiet rhythm, though the house on Aspen Ridge Drive stood as a lingering scar for years. Its new owners, unaware of its full history, repainted the walls and replaced the windows, but neighbors said they still saw lights flicker late at night, as if some part of the past refused to rest. In reflecting on the broader impact of the case, sociologists and legal experts pointed to it as a modern morality play, a story that exposed how easily truth can be distorted when filtered through emotion, reputation, and media. The early days of coverage had shown how quickly society rushes to define victim and villain without knowing the full story. In Emily's case, her tearful calls and bruised arms made her instantly believable. In Daniel's case, his frustration and silence painted him guilty. It was a stark reminder of how deeply society's perception of innocence is tied to appearance and gender expectations. The case also reignited discussions about the ethics of empathy in an age where emotional narratives dominate public discourse. People realized that compassion, while necessary, can be manipulated, and that blind belief without scrutiny can lead to devastating consequences. Truth, as one columnist wrote, isn't always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's the one no one wants to hear. At its core, this story was not just about murder. It was about control, perception, and the human instinct to rewrite reality when it becomes unbearable. Emily's need to be seen as a victim had consumed her. Daniel's need to be understood had gone unheard. Both were trapped in a cycle of misunderstanding until it ended in irreversible tragedy. And yet there's something hauntingly universal in that dynamic. Most people crave to be believed, to have their pain acknowledged. But the line between truth and fabrication can blur when self-image becomes survival. Emily's lie began small, one call, one accusation, but it spiraled until it dictated her entire existence. She became a prisoner of her own story long before the police ever cuffed her wrists. Years later, when Megan was asked in an interview whether she forgave Emily, she paused for a long time. "Forgiveness isn't for her," she finally said. "It's for me. I can't live with hate, but I'll never understand how someone could look into my brother's eyes and still think of themselves as the victim." Her words carried no anger, only sorrow. By then, Emily had been in prison for nearly a decade. She rarely spoke, but she continued to write. Her final entry, discovered after her death from natural causes in her cell, read, "He kept saying I was wrong, that I lied. Maybe I did, but when no one believes you long enough, the lie starts to feel safer than the truth." Her death went mostly unnoticed. No reporters came, no vigils were held. The state filed her remains under unclaimed, and her belongings were boxed and discarded. But in a way, that anonymity was her final punishment and her final freedom. The case left behind no heroes, no clean resolutions, only lessons. It reminded the world that justice is imperfect, that empathy can be weaponized, and that truth is often buried beneath layers of perception. It showed that even ordinary people, when driven by desperation, can commit extraordinary harm. In the end, the tragedy of Daniel and Emily was not about who was good or evil. It was about what happens when fear replaces honesty, and when the need to be believed outweighs the need to be truthful. Provo moved on, the seasons changed, new families moved in, but the story lived quietly in the minds of those who remembered, serving as a warning whispered through the years.